Hello, everyone. This is what your pastor didn't tell you. Today, we're talking about a very fancy topic. We're talking about the flood myths of around the world, whether it's how it's related to Genesis, how it's related to Noah, and all that kind of stuff. Today, we have Lachlan from Tablets and Temples, and he's gonna give us a lot of interesting info. How are you doing today, Lachlan?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me on.
Awesome. All right. So, just for people that aren't familiar with your work and your YouTube channel, can you give us a little intro about yourself?
So I run a YouTube channel called Tablets and Temples, where we look at ancient history and religion. We do a lot of biblical study stuff, as I'm a student of biblical studies myself. And so the whole flood thing I became interested in a few weeks ago. And so I've sort of been going through that on some of my social media platforms. So yeah, fun to talk about it.
Yeah, awesome. All right. So, could you give us just, a hint of what we were talking about? Can you give people just like the quick facts about what you have learned, like maybe just some interesting things that just like really stood out to you as you've been going through these different myths?
I think what I hear a lot is that there's a saying that every culture around the world has a flood myth. It's something that you see a lot
Right.
on social media in debates, and it's often brought up in ways to try and defend the idea that there was a global flood, like a single flood event. But I think when you actually look at all of the individual flood stories, the picture is much more complicated, and the flood stories are much more diverse and varied than I think people realize. It's one of those things that I think sounds really good or sounds really interesting as a statement, but when you actually get into the weeds and look at the details, it's very, very different.
Hmm. Yeah, that is really interesting. Okay. All right. Question for you. Do all cultures have flood myths?
It's a difficult question to answer
Okay.
because if you actually collated all the flood myths that anthropologists from around the world have collected, so there's a couple of books. There's James Fraser's book from the early 1900s, which has, I don't know, 70, 80 flood myths. There's another 30, 40 in a 1980s book by Alan Dundes. But if you were to find all the different ones around the world, maybe you could get 100, 200. But I mean, how many unique cultures are there around the world?
Hmm.
Thousands. How many are linked together? I will say, apart from Antarctica, there are flood myths from every continent in the world, and many, many people groups have
Hmm.
flood myths. But when you actually look at them, they aren't all global flood stories, like
Hmm.
the story of Noah's Ark, where the entire world floods. A lot of them are local flood stories, and we'll look at those as we sort of go through each of the individual ones. Not all the
Hmm.
stories are truly ancient. So when you think about ancient history, I mean, typically it's sort of cut off at 500 CE or AD. Uh, Not all of these flood stories, in fact, the vast majority would not be older than that. Most of them are post Christian, post colonial. So
Hmm.
that is, colonial powers have come to interact with indigenous peoples from around the world and collected stories, but a lot of those stories have already been influenced by missionaries. Not all of them. There are like plenty of truly indigenous flood stories from around the world, but they're not truly ancient stories. So I think when people hear this idea that every culture has a flood story, they think every culture has a flood story that dates back thousands of years and is a global event. But that's not the case at all. Um,
Hmm.
so, does every culture have one? I don't think so. I mean, there's some big examples of ones that don't. So, Egypt uh, doesn't really have a global flood story. It's got some like kind of flood y elements in some stories, but nothing like the sort of global deluge story of Noah's Ark.
Hmm.
And that's particularly surprising because Egypt did a lot of trade with Babylon, with
Hmm.
Persia, with so with Greece, Greece had a flood story. Persia doesn't actually have a flood story. We'll get to that, but they're they did a lot of trade with those cultures like Greece and Babylon that had a flood story, and they didn't adopt a global flood story. Africa has very, very few flood stories, and they have lots of different unique cultures, but only a handful of what could be called truly indigenous flood stories. And they also have a lot of flood stories which are clearly influenced by missionaries. And yeah, as I mentioned, Persia doesn't really have a native flood story. We can talk about that one a bit more in detail after, but the Zoroastrian texts like
Yep.
the Avesta, there's not a flood story in those texts. I think for them it's a long winter, like a snow story. Um, it's very different. So no, not every culture has a flood myth. I've heard of other ones too. Like apparently Japan doesn't have one. I haven't looked particularly into that one. Uh, but there's some quite significant and ancient cultures that don't have a flood myth. But that said, there are many around the world. There's lots and lots of flood stories, and it is interesting, some of the similarities, but they are easily explained, as we'll sort of talk a bit more about.
Oh wow, you really handed your cards out there. No, 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 that's good. No, I appreciate that. That is really interesting, analyzing how you can have so many similarities, so many of a story of specific kind, just like a flood, in so many different areas, and how we explain that is a bit of a conundrum that I'll be interested to hear what you say. So, let's talk about like just the individual myths and um, obviously, most people are familiar with the biblical story of Noah's flood, whether you want to call that a myth or not. I don't care. But, most people are familiar with that. But I guess maybe could you talk about just really quick what that story's about? That way we have something to compare to compared to these other stories, whether you know how similar they are and all that.
Yeah, sure. So the Noah story is obviously God is upset with humanity for wickedness. The exact type of wickedness is not really gone into in great detail, but the Bible says he regrets making mankind, so he is going to send a flood to destroy the world and destroy mankind. And he warns one family, and that's Noah and his family, to build a boat. They construct the vessel, and then it floods for a number of days. Uh, Biblical scholars see that there's actually sort of two threads woven together, maybe from two different sources, where the flood happens for 150 days in one and for a different number of days in another. So it does seem like there might be two sources of flood story being woven together into the one tale. But after the flood, the waters recede. Noah comes out. He makes sacrifices to Yahweh, and that's sort of the end of that sort of section of the flood story. And God sends
Hmm.
the rainbow to promise to never flood the world again. So it's a fairly well known story.
Right, right. We have that story, and then something very similar that lots of people love to talk about is the Mesopotamian flood myths. So, could you maybe give a quick little summary of that? Maybe point out some similarities that are interesting there.
Yeah. So the Mesopotamian flood myths, they're the oldest flood myths that we have access to. So there's the
Okay.
oldest surviving texts. The oldest is what's called the Sumerian flood story. It's sometimes also called Eridu Genesis. I always butcher these pronunciations too. But it sort of dates to, I'll just bring it up. Yeah, it could be as old as 2050 BCE, and it could be as young as maybe like the 1700s BCE. So that is one of the oldest flood stories, if not the oldest, that we
Hmm.
have access to. Um, Actually, sorry, I tell a lie. We can cut that. Well, I'll start that. Yeah, you can cut.
There you go.
I got that one wrong. I'll start that answer again. Yeah, so the Sumerian flood stories are actually the oldest flood stories that we have. There's two Sumerian flood stories that we really have access to that are very, very old. The Death of Gilgamesh is a poem about the Gilgamesh character, who's written much more about, who's written much more later in later periods. So the Death of Gilgamesh is very fragmentary. It really only just mentions a flood. That story dates to as far back as 2050 BCE. The actual
Mm,
Sumerian flood story, which we have about a third of, so two-thirds is missing, and we've reconstructed about a third of that text. That dates to about 1900 BCE or later. So that story is sort of the bare bones of the Mesopotamian flood story. So in that one, there's a king, Ziusudra. He's warned about a flood by the gods, that they are going to destroy humanity, and he's told to build a vessel, and so he does, and he survives the flood. The more complete flood stories build on that same tradition. So the two that most people are familiar with are Atrahasis and Gilgamesh. So Atrahasis, which dates to about the 1700s BCE, that story is a little bit different, but has the same sort of elements as the Sumerian flood story. So in that one, the gods are they make humans to sort of take over their labor. So the gods don't want to do all the work anymore, so they make the humans do it. But the humans become too populous, so they're making all this noise, making all this racket, and the chief god Enlil, he can't sleep. So he gets annoyed and he's thinking, okay, I'm going to wipe humans out. So he tries a drought and he tries a famine, and they don't work because the humans just keep repopulating. So he decides to send a flood. And one of his counterparts, the god Ea, who is also sometimes called Enki, depending on the tradition and the period that it comes from. So Ea, he warns this person, Atrahasis. Now, we're not told whether Atrahasis is special for any reason. Is he a king? We don't know. But he and his family are told to build a boat and to bring animals on board. And what's really interesting is that in the primary Atrahasa story, we don't get a lot of the details of like the boat building and what sort of animals he's got to bring on. But not that long ago, we translated a newly discovered tablet that contains part of the story of Atrahasis. And in that version, it goes into much more detail about how to build the boat and what sort of things to take on board. And there's some very
mm,
interesting things on there. The size of the boat is about the same as the one you find in the Bible. So it's around 1,500, yeah, 15,000 cubits squared. I always get
mm,
the measurements wrong. So it's got that sort of size. It's a different shape. It's round. But the other thing is that the god tells Atrahasis to bring animals on board two by two. So, you've got something very familiar there from the biblical story, taking animals on two by two.
mm,
So Atrahasis survives the flood in his ark, and then the waters recede. He comes out, he makes sacrifices to the gods, and again from the ark tablet, the gods promise. Oh, sorry, not the ark tablet, but another fragment of a different Atrahasis story. The gods make a promise to not destroy the world. Um, in the main story, the gods actually curse humans to have things like miscarriages and stillbirths so that the population never becomes that large. So that's the story I wanted to go sort of in depth on because it's a core story in Mesopotamia. Because
mm,
then Gilgamesh, the one that everyone's heard of, the famous Gilgamesh, that story, the flood story in Gilgamesh, appropriates the Atrahasa story.
mm,
So in Gilgamesh, the flood is just a really tiny part of a much bigger story. So
right.
Gilgamesh, his best friend Enkidu, has died. They were once rivals. They became friends. He died, and now Gilgamesh is contemplating mortality. So he's on the quest for eternal life. And along the way, he finds this guy named Utnapishtim. And Utnapishtim is immortal. and how he got that immortality. He tells the story to Gilgamesh of the Great Flood. And it's basically the Atrahasis story with the names changed. There are a few other interesting details, though, such as at the end, Utnapishtim releases birds, a raven, a dove, and another bird. So he releases three birds to see whether the waters had receded. So there's a very interesting line, though, in Gilgamesh, in that flood story, where Utnapishtim is called Atrahasis. Was that a mistake by the editor, or was that a deliberate? Have they become conflated? Regardless, it's clear that the Gilgamesh flood story is building upon the Atrahasis flood story.
Huh.
So those are the main Mesopotamian traditions. Um, yeah, so
Yeah, really interesting. Okay. So then of course we have the Greeks. So that's you know, I guess depending on when you date, the Genesis text, that's a little bit later, but definitely much later than the Babylonian texts, so, or maybe I guess you consider that Mesopotamian. But yeah, so let's talk about the Greek ones. What's going on there?
yeah, so the first Greek text that's worth talking about is actually Mesopotamian as well, kind of.
Okay.
So there's a guy, a Greek historian, who is a Babylonian, whose name is Berossus.
Yeah.
And so sorry, I'll just quickly, he's writing in around 50 BC to, oh no, sorry, not 50 BC, 3rd century BCE. So I'll start that again. Uh, so there's a guy in a Babylonian man named Berossus who sorry, I'll just start the whole thing again. Okay.
There you
So
go.
the Greek myths, the first one that's worth talking about is actually Babylonian in origin. So there's a
Hmm.
guy named Berossus who is Babylonian, but he writes in Greek. And so he's from about the 3rd century BCE. And so Berossus, he's recounting the Mesopotamian version of the story. But what's really interesting is that even though he's writing a few hundred years after Gilgamesh, and Gilgamesh is by far the most widespread flood story in the area, right? Like you find it in all these different places. So Gilgamesh is
Hmm.
the most popular. But Berossus, when he recounts the Mesopotamian flood story, his character that he uses is called Zisuthras. Again, my pronunciation is not great, but that's his Greek delineation for the name Ziusudra, which goes all
Hmm.
the way back to the oldest Sumerian flood story. Now, Berossus, he incorporates some Greek deities into the Mesopotamian story. So instead of the god Ea or Enki warning the hero of the flood, it's the Greek god Kronos, who you might know from video games or being I think he's sometimes referred to as the god of time. But Kronos, he is the one that warns Zisuthras to build the boat and survive it. And so that is very interesting because the Berossus's story, he his boat is more in line with sort of the Noah's Ark shape of the boat, where it's more like boat like and long and rectangular rather than the Atrahasis story, which is like this round, what they call a coracle.
Hmm.
You can find a picture for it if you look up coracle. And the Gilgamesh version, it's a cube, so it's a perfectly, all the sides are even. But
Hmm.
the Noah story is the same size but a different shape. So it's the rectangular sort of oblong sort of shape, and so is Berossus's the arc that he recounts. And what a lot of scholars wonder or suspect is that it's very clear to scholars that the biblical account is drawing from the Mesopotamian traditions, and they're drawing from later traditions, right? So
Hmm.
They're not drawing from the oldest Sumerian version. They're incorporating things like two by two animals and the birds going out and seeing if the floodwaters have receded. And there's a very plausible situation in which that happened, in which the Israelites were taken into exile. The most literate class of Israelites were taken into exile by the Babylonians. But there's a scholar who sort of wrote a paper arguing that, well, actually, maybe it wasn't just Gilgamesh, but a different tradition in Mesopotamia that Berosus is also drawing from, because there's some
Hmm.
interesting similarities between the biblical story and Berosus. And they would never have known each, like Berosus, he wasn't drawing from the biblical account,
Hmm.
and the biblical story was written before Berosus, but maybe they drew from a shared Mesopotamian tradition which is now lost. But apart from that, there's another Greek legend, and that's the flood of Deucalion. And so that story is truly Greek, so it's not Mesopotamian in origin.
Hmm.
So Deucalion, he's mentioned as a flood story, flood survivor as far back as Plato. So Plato's like 400s BCE, but only in passing. You don't actually get the full flood story until around the turn of the millennia, so around 1 CE, and that's in Ovid's Metamorphosis, which very famous. So Deucalion, he was the son of Prometheus, and then Zeus sets out to destroy humankind. So Prometheus warned Deucalion. He built a boat. The flood reached the mountains, and it mentions that there were other people who survived on the top of the mountains. And so Deucalion's ship came to rest upon the mountain, and he disembarks, makes sacrifices to Zeus, and then the gods help Deucalion and his wife, Phaira, repopulate the earth, and they do it by turning stones into people. Now, that story is Greek in origin, but at the same time, many scholars see that as influenced by the Mesopotamian traditions. And there are quite a lot of Mesopotamian influences in Greek mythology.
Sure.
Gilgamesh, obviously, being very popular in the ancient world. You see it in the works like the Odyssey, Homer's Odyssey. So it's not unheard of that there's influence from the Babylonians to the Greeks. And scholars look at the Deucalion story and suggest that it probably was influenced by the Mesopotamian flood tradition.
All right. So, those are the Greek myths. What about let's go ahead and go to China. So they have their own little different myths. What do you know about that?
Yeah, so China's interesting because there's not really a pre-Christian global flood myth. So the oldest sustained flood narrative is found in texts that date to what they call the Warring States period. So that is, I've got it in my notes here, 475 to 221 BCE. So
Oh.
there's a text called Shangshu, beginning with the canon of Yao, and so this is stories of sort of the origins of Chinese emperors. And so there's a flood story in here. And it threatens the text says it threatens the mountains and it threatens the heavens, and that might lead you to believe, oh, it's a scary global flood. But a global flood is actually not in view when you closely read the story, because people continue to work and continue to live in the land while this flood is going on, because the flood is actually about all these people doing this sort of work to divert the waters. So
Hmm.
the story basically goes, Yao appoints a man named, so the emperor appoints a man named Gun to control the flooding. And Gun, he
Hmm.
works for 9 years. Uh, and in that time, Yao is succeeded by Shun. And again, I apologize to anyone for my pronunciations. But Shun imprisons Gun because Gun has failed. He couldn't fix the floodwaters. So then he appoints a new man named Yu. And Yu is successful. So he manages to divert the rivers into the seas. And then he becomes the emperor. So that flood story is clearly not envisioning everybody being wiped out. It might use
Right.
some exaggerated language, but it's envisioning that there's people still living in the land trying to work to control these floodwaters so that they can do agriculture. And in the Middle Ages, there was a scholar, an Arab scholar. Again, I'll probably butcher this, but his name is Abu Zaid al Sirafi. And in the 900s, Common Era, so he recounts a traveler visiting China and taking a diary and discussing the flood of Noah with the Chinese emperor. And the emperor informed him that while it being a nice story, that flood never reached China because they don't have a global flood myth. Now, there are regional sort of flood stories in China that anthropologists have looked at, which are more similar to the Noah's Ark story, but those are post missionary stories. And so scholars, suspect that there probably was the influence of missionaries. And I'll see if I can find the date there
Oh,
um, for the for those the missionary activity. Um, yeah, so there were missionaries, Nestorian churches from 635 CE. Missionaries had visited, and there were churches from 1300s in such as the province of Yunnan. So you can sort of see that the main Chinese flood myth is not a global flood story, but there are some sort of more localized flood stories that probably influenced by missionaries.
oh, interesting. So you're saying, and just maybe you're not an expert on this. It's okay if not. But when were these ancient missionaries, these local myths, when would these have been influenced? Do you know?
Oh well, so yeah, as I mentioned, like you've got missionaries visiting from 600s CE, and you've got churches established from the 1300s CE. And you're
Okay.
not
Yeah.
hearing about these regional stories, these anthropologists going and finding these stories until like 18th, 19th, 20th century. So
Huh.
yeah, a lot of time has passed. But the most ancient Chinese stories that we actually have
Yeah.
access to, and there's a book. Yeah, your listeners can go and read it. I think it's called "The Flood Myths of Early China." So that's a great book. It's a book I used in my research. Um, that will sort of talk about the earliest flood myths, which again can go back to as far as like 400 BCE, maybe.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. And what about India? What do we have there?
Yeah, so India is also particularly interesting because they're outside of China. They're one of the other few places that has truly ancient flood stories.
Hmm.
So there's a flood story in the Shatap. Again, I'm terrible with these pronunciations, but the Shatapatha Brahmana. So the translator of the Sanskrit version, he would date that
Mm-hmm.
to about 300 BCE. So that's when he's dating it to. Some scholars think it might preserve earlier traditions, maybe as far back as like 500 to 700. Uh, but that's sort of like the window that you're looking at for that. And we're not sure in that case. So in that tale, it's called Manu and the Fish. So this man,
Mm-hmm.
Manu, he's washing in water when a fish comes into his hand. And the fish talks to him and warns him of an impending flood. And the fish promises to protect him as long as, in exchange, the man would protect the little fish from being eaten by a bigger fish. So he puts him in like a jar, and then the fish grows bigger and outgrows the jar. And depending on the version, he might try a couple of different vessels before eventually putting him in the ocean. And then once the fish is in the ocean, it gets really big. And it's important for the story. It's a horned fish. So it's got like a horn coming out of its head. I guess maybe like a narwhal. That's kind of how it's depicted in art. So The fish, the man's kept his promise. The fish is now in the ocean. It's a big fish now. It can look after itself. So the fish tells him that there's going to be this big flood and that
Mm,
he should prepare a vessel. So the man does. He prepares a boat and he ties a rope around the fish's horn, and the fish carries him through the flood waters. They land on a mountain, I believe, or in the hills, and it's just Manu. He's the only survivor in the
mm,
earliest version of the story. So in that version, he has to perform some Vedic rituals and sacrifices, and then what's called a daughter comes out of the ocean, and they repopulate the world. It's a bit unclear. Some people, some scholars look at it as like that they've incest and that they've had natural children. Other scholars look at it as maybe that the children came out of the ocean just like she did.
mm,
It's not really clear from the text. And then so that's the earliest version, and that story gets sort of retold in different texts. So the Mahabharata, the text that I think more people are familiar with, that's the giant epic. Like it's over uh, I think it's got 1,000,000 words in it, maybe. I might have that wrong, but it's this huge epic. But that text, which is obviously composite from a lot of different things, but in the Mahabharata, the oldest sort of versions that we have, there's that story, but Manu, this time he's accompanied by 7 sages, like deities, and the fish is a deity. Um, what's interesting about the Indian story is that it does have like these similarities to the Mesopotamian version in that he gets warned by a deity, he creates a vessel. Is there any link? There's obviously the Indus Valley in between, you know, those sort of regions of modern day India and ancient Mesopotamia on the other side, sort of around the Persian Gulf. Like they're not too far from each other. They did do trade, so we know that there was quite ancient trade between them, and there was also trade with the Greeks. So, is there a relationship between the Indian and the Mesopotamian or the Greek versions? And so, as I was looking into this, there actually is. So, the scholars that have sort of written on this recently, the majority of scholarship do suggest that there is some sort of what they call a genetic link between the stories. Not that the Indian scribes sat down, with a version of Gilgamesh and then wrote their own version. It's not like that,
yeah.
but that through things like trade, they may have become familiar with the stories. And one of the clues that people look into is in the Mahabharata version. It seems like there's a misunderstanding of taking seed onto the vessel. So in the one of the Mesopotamian versions, there's instructions to take seed, and that they were referring to like the seed of life, so like the animals, the actual animals. And
Mm,
in the Mahabharata version, he takes like literal seed, which turns into animals. And so there's an article looking at whether that was actually a language barrier sort of misunderstanding of that story. And there's a few other details in there, like so Enki or Ea, he is often portrayed as a fish deity, and in the Indian version, it's a fish
right.
deity that rescues the man. And there's a few other little bits and pieces that scholars look at.
Mm. All right, yeah, let's go on to the next one. What do we have here? All right, so we have done India. What about America? What's so special? This is where it gets interesting.
Yeah, so America's obviously a huge continent. You've got South America, North America. So I'll start with South America, and some of the flood myths there. So the Incas, they have a flood story. It's very interesting. So theirs is about a flood called Unu Pakakuti, and there's multiple versions of this story. So one is recorded, and again, so these are recorded post-colonially. So these are after sort of I believe in this case, like the Spanish and Portuguese, they're coming through. So this is in the 1500s by a man named Sarmiento de Gamboa. And so he recounts how the deity Viracocha created a race of giants, and they transgressed, so the deity wipes them out with a flood. And that's particularly interesting because, as
Yeah.
well as flood myths being from around the world, there are other stories of giants existing before humans from around the world. And that's probably a topic for a different video. But that's sort of an interesting version. There's a story from Cape Frio of two brothers fighting, and so during their fight, the village gets transported up to heaven, but they are stuck on Earth. And so the first brother gets really angry and he stomps his foot so hard that a spring of water starts gushing out until it starts to cover the Earth. And so they climb trees with their wives, and sort of the story explains how there's these two different tribes descended from these two different brothers. Oh, apologies, I'm going to turn my phone on silent. Um, sorry. So the two brothers, they climb trees with their wives, and they survive the flood that way. And the story sort of explains how there's two different tribes that come from these two brothers who are fighting, and the two tribes perpetually feud with each other. So the story is
Hmm.
etiological, right? It's explaining
Yeah.
why these two tribes are fighting. There's several mountain stories where people climb mountains to survive a flood, and there's an interesting element in a couple of the stories where birds. So the people are stuck on the mountains, the floodwaters rise. In some of them, the floods keep rising, and so the mountain magically gets taller. But at the end of one of the stories, these birds come along and they start dropping dirt in the water, and that forms the land. So that they're carrying dirt and they drop it, and then sort of the islands and lands sort of reform. Then, as you move to sort of North America, um, Aztecs is very interesting. So, I gotta kind of preface this: Aztec is a bit of a nebulous term, and it's sort of it doesn't really encompass any one group, nor is it a particularly good umbrella term. It's just a term that people are familiar with. So it's some tribes in central Mexico are sometimes called Aztecs. So
Mhm.
they're what's called the Aztec Sunstone. So that's this great carving. I don't know if you want to bring a picture of it up, but people can look it up. The Aztec Sunstone, even just in the edit. But so it's produced in the 1500s. So again, this is post-colonial. So colonists have come through, sort of starting around the 1500s. But this sunstone is considered indigenous, but it's the sort of same sort of thing that the movie 2012 where there was sort of the
Yeah.
Mayan calendar, and there was going to be the end of the world in 2012. So that's kind of the same idea. This sunstone is this great carving, and it describes how the world was destroyed four times, and that the current world we live in is the fifth world. And so in the first world, jaguars ate all the humans, or panthers, or depending on the
Mhm.
story. In the second story, hurricanes destroyed the world, and this time the humans are all turned into monkeys. Then the world's remade, but fire destroys the world, and the humans are turned into turkeys. Then in the fourth, this is so that's the sunstone. So then there's a great flood, and in this one, the humans get turned into fish. Now, there's different versions of this story where the tragedies are in different orders. So sometimes the flood it might be like one or two, sometimes it's the fourth, but we're always in the fifth iteration. Now, this fifth world mythology is kind of interesting because you can also find it in the Navajo further north, in
Hmm.
North America. So, one of the sort of more narrative versions of the story. So it's not a narrative, right? It's sort of just depicted on the sunstone. This is sort of the state of things. But one of the more
Yeah.
narrative versions comes from 1558 in the Nahuatl language. It's called "The Legend of the Suns." And it describes a man and a woman who are warned of a great flood by the deity Tezcatlipoca, and they survive in a hollow tree. And they get hungry and they cook fish. And at the end of the story, and the smoke comes out, but it angers the gods. And so the main god comes down and he turns all the people into dogs. So it's like these stories are very, very different to what you're seeing in like the Mesopotamian, the Noah's Ark
Sure.
story, and particularly in this sort of region, there's this idea that after the flood, the humans actually get turned into animals. Um, and then obviously more humans come along later. But then as you sort of go into sort of North American, American Indian stories, a good example is the Algonquin have a story that has variants in some tribes where a man is saved from a flood on a raft, and he has a beaver and a muskrat dive down into the water, and I think one of them gets too tired and they can't swim to the bottom, but the otter goes down and comes back with some mud, and they use that mud to make the land, and the land reform. And I think that's kind of interesting. It's sort of in the same vein as like the birds coming and dropping dirt in and reforming the land. This idea that these animals come with dirt and that's how the land gets reformed. So you sort of see similar motifs across the region, which is very interesting. And like, there's heaps of other stories from different tribes. Some of them are influenced by missionaries, sort of, after the post-colonial period. Some of them are clearly indigenous, but there's quite a diversity of traditions.
Mhm. Hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. Okay. So, uh, got a couple more here. Feel free to go as quick as you want on them. These are, those more small areas. You have Scandinavia, Africa. What do you have to say about those?
Yeah, Africa. I think Africa is a good case study. So like Egypt doesn't really have a global flood myth.
Mm,
There's like one kind of story in, I think it's called the Book of the Heavenly Cow. Great name. But in that story, one of the gods already kills the humans because they were rebelling against the gods, and then afterwards, a different god. There's a few survivors, and in order to protect them, a different god floods the world with beer and tricks the first god into drinking the beer, and that god gets drunk. So yeah, sure, it's a flood myth, but it's not really. That's not why the people were wiped out. That it was a different utility for the flood in order to get this god drunk on beer. Um, there is People sort of talk about the Egyptian historian Manetho,
mm,
and how he might recount a flood story, but he's just recounting the Greek flood story. So he doesn't even recount it; he just sometimes mentions the Greek flood story.
mm,
Um, and so when he talks about the flood, that's the sort of thing he's talking about, because he's writing in the Hellenistic period, and there are actually no original surviving works of his. You only get what people much much later
sure.
quote from him.
Right.
So of all the ancient Egyptian literature that we have, there is no Egyptian flood myth. And so, which is again quite surprising, given that they did trade with Babylon, they did trade with Greece, and the Nile is an area particularly known for flooding. But their flood myths are very
Yep.
different in that it's about this cycle of the Nile flooding and receding, and that brings fertility to the land. So, yeah, not really a global deluge myth from Egypt. There's lots of different tribes in Africa, but only a few flood stories. And in fact, many people, many famous like anthropologists, like Dr. Livingstone is one. He records that he didn't really come across any native flood myths. He thought he might have come across one lake flood story about a lake flooding, but he didn't really come across any flood myths. Now, since then, that's like early 1900s. Since then, we have sort of found a few what might be indigenous African flood stories,
Mm,
but there's other ones that are very clearly just influenced by missionaries. So the Maasai, They have a story which is just very much the biblical story. So their God was angered by the first murder, so he just chooses to flood the world. He chooses a man to save with his wives, sons, and a boat. And at the end, he lets a dove out, and then there's rainbows at the end to show that the wrath of God is over. That is a story that scholars unanimously agree is clearly just influenced by missionaries who have come to the area, and then that story is getting recounted to the anthropologists.
Hmm.
And a lot of these anthropologists are also missionaries themselves. It's probably worth adding to, and it's not just Christian missionaries either. They're obviously, throughout Africa too. You have Islamic missionaries as well. So it's not just like one sort of, because they also have the Noah story is very important. So there's a Kaka legend in Africa, which is recorded in the 60s, about a brother and sister who were warned by a goat that their village would get flooded. And so they went to a remote place with no other people, and the goat told them that they could marry. And so they did. And so that's an interesting motif of a brother and sister having to get married, because you can also find that in some of the Chinese and Indian flood myths as well.
Hmm.
There's a Tanzanian story about a magic pot. So this father has a pot of water and he tells his daughter-in-law not to touch it. And then one day she touches it and it smashes, and it floods the whole land. So there's a few like indigenous flood stories there, but they're very very different to the global deluge myth.
Hmm.
Scandinavia is very interesting. I always just like to include it because it's definitely the most metal of all the flood stories. So it's recorded in the 1200s, and it's about the deity Bor, and he has three sons: Odin, most people have heard of, Willie, and Way. Again, probably mispronouncing these. Anyway, so together they slay a giant, and the blood from the giant gushes out and floods the world, and they escape in a boat. So again, that's it's. I mean, it's very different to the biblical story. There's no flood of blood, but they escape in a boat. But again, there's probably Christian influence. It probably has some Germanic core to it. But Iceland converted to Christianity in 1000. So by 1200, which
Hmm.
is when the story is recorded, you've already got Christian influence on Norse mythology. So
Hmm.
I guess a few other from areas like Europe doesn't actually have that many other flood stories. There's one in Wales. It's very different, but there's a very interesting one. The Romani people, who used to be referred to erroneously and as a derogatory term as gypsies. So we don't use that term anymore, but it's the Romani. So, but in that story, a man keeps a small vessel, and in it he has a fish, and his wife wants to eat it, but the husband promises to protect the fish. Anyway, the wife can't help herself, and eventually she roasts the fish, and this causes a great flood. And they
What?
survive by building a boat and bringing animals and stuff. You think, well, that's very very similar to the Indian flood story, which is particularly interesting because the Romani people trace their ancestry to India, particularly North India,
Hmm.
the region where the story originates.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's also possible that Christian elements became infused, but I think there's an interesting connection there. Yeah.
Hmm. So tell me again how roasting a fish causes a flood.
Yeah. So, well, in that story, I'm not sure why, but it's just that's part of that legend. He's supposed to protect
Okay.
the fish, but because he's failed, it brings about a flood. Yeah.
Oh, okay. And Australia. So this one you should be an expert on.
Ah, well, look, yes. So these are stories that I actually did learn in school. So indigenous, what they
Oh,
call dream time stories.
okay.
These are stories we get told as kids, so we learn about the sort of indigenous culture. So the most famous story is called Tiddalik, and it's one you'll find in a lot of children's books. And I guess it's actually not a bad parallel, just in terms of thematically to the Noah story, because in Noah's Ark is a very tragic, horrible story. Like everyone dies, but in the
Yep.
children's book, no one focuses on that. Well, it's the same for this Tiddalik story. In the original story, everyone dies, but the children's book you should read are very much different. Very much the PG version. So in this story, so
Huh.
Dreamtime stories are mostly about animals, and they sort of explain different aspects of why the world is the way that it is. And so Tiddalik is a frog, and he swallows up all the world's water, or at least all the water in the land. And so he becomes this giant bloated frog. And all the animals, well, they're really hungry and thirsty. Sorry. And so they're like, well, we can't get anything to drink. So how about we try and get the frog to release the water? So they thought that they would try and make the frog laugh. So they try all these different tricks to try and get the frog to laugh, but nothing's really working until the eel comes along. And the eel starts twisting itself into all these different shapes and convoluting itself, contorting itself. And for some reason, this just makes the frog crack up. He can't hold it any longer. So he sees the eel, and then all the water just bursts out into this great deluge. And in the original story, everyone drowns, and except for the pelican goes out and saves as many people as he can,
Hmm.
because obviously the pelican's got a big mouth. And that story explains why, because the pelican gets wet, and that causes him to have different color on him. So it sort of explains why pelicans are black and white. That's sort of the reason for that in that particular story. And that one's very clearly, evidently a pre-Christian tradition. But there's another flood legend, which is basically Noah's Ark, and instead of
Hmm.
Noah's Ark, being up, in sort of the Mesopotamian Canaanite region, it floats over the St George's Ranges in Australia, and it carries the Aborigines. And what's interesting though is that in some versions, only the white people perish in the flood, and this is why that they don't return until Captain Cook's arrival. And in some versions, the Ark is a tall ship with a mast and sails, and so this clearly betrays colonial influence, and
Huh.
that this story has then been infused, maybe what once had a core indigenous, element, but it's been infused with these missionary elements to sort of explain the real tragedy of what was happening in the 17 and 1800s. So
Hmm.
they've taken those elements because they wouldn't have seen a tall ship, before
Yep.
then. So now the Ark is a tall ship, and you actually see the
Hmm.
same thing across the ditch in New Zealand too. So there's a Maori flood myth. Um, I know I'm pretty bad at translation. I don't even know if I can begin to tackle this word. Para Wenamia. And in that story, the I'm just going to call them Para. In that story, the tribes split and they forget the worship of their founding gods. And so Para and his father try to keep the faith, but everyone makes fun of them. And so they want to convince people of God's power. So they pray for rain. The rain comes down, floods the world, but they've got a raft, and they bring all these survivors onto the raft. And anyone who
Hmm.
wasn't on it perished. And then everyone thanks them, and they repopulate the country. And what scholars look at is how that story is clearly influenced by Christian missionaries, but also probably has an indigenous core. And the story is actually about how, when missionaries came and when the colonial powers came to New Zealand,
Hmm.
there was a desire to convert to Christianity for the material benefits that it brought, but also there was a fear at the rejection of native religion and rejecting those native gods. And
Hmm.
so scholars look at that story as a sort of a blending of Christian and indigenous traditions that deals with this problem of, we've been presented new gods and rejected our old gods. But that also, there's a danger in that as well, and we don't want to just reject our own gods. And so, sort of taking the Noah's Ark themes and putting it into that sort of element.
Hmm.
Um, So it really encourages the Maori to retain their traditional beliefs whilst
Hmm.
also assimilating elements from the missionary story.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really fascinating. Okay. So, I mean, you talked about all these different similarities, and some of these are clearly, obviously, like missionary influence there. You know, sails and, colonial looking ships and stories like that, like obviously. So I guess, is that the only explanation, or what kind of reasons have people proposed for why we have so many similarities in all these
Yeah.
different texts?
Yeah. So I want to be clear. Uh, yes, post colonial powers and Christian missionaries did influence many flood stories around the world, but not all of them. There are
Hmm.
lots of indigenous flood stories from around the world. And the thing is that they're very varied, they're very different. Um, there are some similar themes, like sometimes surviving on a vessel, but there's also like a whole bunch of different ways that people survive. Sometimes they climb a mountain, sometimes an animal rescues them, sometimes no one survives. So it's not like that there's just one thing that happens in these stories.
Hmm.
There's lots of different things. And I think the best thing I can do is quote a scholar named Dorothy Vitaliano. They have a
Okay.
great quote from a book called Legends of the Earth, where they look at the flood myths and modern science and geology. At the time, it's 1973, although she continued to publish into the 2000s. But yeah, so this is her quote. There is not one deluge legend, but rather a collection of traditions which is so diverse they can neither be explained by one general catastrophe nor by the dissemination of one local tradition.
Hmm.
Some are highly imaginative, but wide of the mark attempts to explain local topographic features or the presence of fossil shells high above sea level. A large number are recollection, vastly distorted and exaggerated, as is the rule in folklore, of real local disasters, often
Hmm.
demonstrably consistent with special local geologic conditions. Flood traditions are nearly universal, but mainly because floods in the plural are the most universal of geologic catastrophes. So I think there's a few things to dive into there, but
Yeah.
there's the main point is that there is not one explanation for why there's flood stories around the world. Sometimes it might be people trying to explain local conditions, like maybe you found a fossil of sea creatures in a mountainous region, and you're like, well, how did that get there? You don't know about plate tectonics and how mountains are formed, and so there's this mythology that becomes created around that. And a lot of the flood stories, particularly in places like South America and the Pacific Islands, the flood story explains how people got into certain regions or how certain mountains formed, and so they're explaining local topographic features. Sometimes the stories are from traditions, so obviously like the Mesopotamian tradition influenced the biblical account, probably influenced the Greek account, probably influenced the Indian account,
Hmm.
or possibly even vice versa if you go back to like Indus Valley pre-written traditions, so that there's traditions that are clearly all sort of related, and then that even goes into sort of the more modern periods where you've got traditions in as far as Europe and the Pacific Islands, Australia, where there's missionary and Christian influence on local traditions, and that becomes this new tradition. And then, of course, you've got this the possibility that some of these were inspired by real local tragedies. Floods are terrifying. Even in Australia, which is known as a particularly like hot and dry country, we get terrifying flooding. We had floods just 2 years ago, which like people died in a developed country with helicopters and boats, but there was
Huh.
like terrible flooding and people lost their lives,
Wow.
and a whole town was destroyed. So floods are terrifying. today, especially back in ancient times. So there's the possibility that some of these flood stories were mythologies that developed out of
Mm,
local events. Um, and like she says, floods are pretty universal. There are other destruction mythologies, or other sort of mythologies that you find very similar features in around the world. So tornado myths are you find tornado myths in North America, you find them in Australia, you find them in South America, you find them in all different places. Now, interestingly, you also happen to find them in the places in the world where there are more tornadoes. If you look at like
yeah.
hotspots, you find tornado myths. You're like, oh, is there a correlation? Oh, maybe. But you also find some very interesting features shared between them. The tornado deity is pretty much always a female, which is interesting because in most cultures, the storm gods are usually male. The ones that use thunder and lightning are usually male. But the tornado mythology is always associated with a female deity. And in places like North America, the tornado mythology also usually revolves around the seasons. So there's tornado seasons. So about half the year you get more tornadoes, half the year you don't. And in those mythologies, it's about this seasonal cycle of this
Yeah.
tornado deity going away and coming back. And so I think like it's very clear that some of these mythologies around the world are based on things that people are observing and
Mhm,
building those stories around. That doesn't explain all of the flood myths, but there's the big point is that there's not just one explanation. There's lots of different reasons that these cultures have flood myths, be it
mm.
explaining something local, be it the experience of a real flood, or be it being influenced by a pre existing tradition. And there's probably other reasons beyond those three as well.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I really like that point about the tornadoes because we certainly have specifically in the Mesopotamian texts, like the ball cycle and uh, you know uh, like a seasonal aspect where or what is it, Mark Enumelish, where it's celebrated every year. It's like retold, like it's happening every year, kind of thing. Um, so and of course Egyptian creation texts apparently they happen every day, every time the sun comes up. But yeah, so that's really interesting how that all those get formed. Um, I did want to ask you about the Mesopotamian text specifically because we can see so many similarities. They're so close, and the differing names, that's really, really interesting. I haven't heard much about that. So, you talked about how, you have Atrahasis in the same text as the Gilgamesh, which is supposedly different flood texts. Um, so where do you think that the biblical text comes in with all that? Like, is there like one tradition where like it's separated into like three or four different ones, or is
Right,
like
right,
the
yeah.
biblical text the very end of that, or how do you see that?
Well, yeah. So, like, there is no doubt at all among scholars that the Mesopotamian versions they're all building on the same, not the one tradition, but they're building on the same ideas. So the
Okay.
Sumerian story has influenced the Akkadian story. The Akkadian stories developed into the Babylonian story, and so it's all the same literary tradition that goes all the way back to Eridu Genesis and the Death of Gilgamesh poem. Those are like the oldest, but like we're only working off the stuff that has survived. It could be some slightly older ones, or some different ones that we don't have access to. Which is probably pretty likely, given that we have access to quite a minority of literature that survives the ancient world.
Hmm.
Um, so, but yeah, scholars are fairly certain that it's all part of the same literary tradition. And so when scholars look at the Noah story, well, it just makes sense, right? The Bible has lots of Babylonian influence on it. Like the Tower of Babel is clearly a post interaction with Babylon story,
Sure.
right? And so in the sort of, you have the two exiles in the, in the 700s, the 500s BCE, first from Assyria, then Babylon. Uh, but even before then, there was stories that scholars are fairly certain predate exile, but they still carry Assyrian or Babylonian influences in them. But it
Mhm.
makes a lot of sense that after the exile, particularly the 586 exile, that, sort of the later Book of Daniel, there's a memory in Jewish literature of the literate classes of Israel being taken into Babylon and learning Babylonian, the language, right? And so, like, that's not just, that's not speculation. That's something that even within Israelite memory, ancient Israelite memory, they believed that that happened, that they were taken away, the most literate classes, and learned to write. So it's really not at all out of the ordinary to think that the those people learned Babylonian traditions. Did they learn the exact flood story from Gilgamesh Tablet 11 and the Ark Tablet of Atrahasis? I don't know. Irving Finkel thinks maybe they did, and he thinks that there's a blending in the biblical story of Atrahasis and Gilgamesh, but it might not be that exact same tradition. It might have been a slightly different tradition, one that also perhaps influenced Berossus as well. Regardless, the biblical story is, it's not, people call it like a rip-off or plagiarized. I think that's like totally anachronistic, but they are clearly inspired by the Babylonian versions, that tradition, and there's clearly elements that they've taken from that, like sending out birds, to find out where, where things are, whether the land has receded, and it's even the same sort of birds. Like there's like the doves in both of the stories. There's the bringing the animals on by two, and the structure of the stories is very similar. The landing on a mountain, right? So there's all these similarities, and scholars just generally agree that it makes the most sense that they learned that story from the older flood stories that already existed before the Bible, like over 1,000 years before the first biblical text was even written.
Mhm. Hmm. Yeah. One more thing that really caught my eye there. So you mentioned that a lot of these other texts are displaying local things like in a global way. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Like, I don't know if you've ever postulated like why people would do that.
Oh well, I mean, I think the perhaps like an example, like the Chinese flood myth, right? It's really a story explaining about how sorry, there's not just one reason for that mythology. If you go read the book Early Flood Myths of China, you'll find there's actually a whole bunch of different reasons those stories were produced. But one of the reasons is to sort of explain, the China's success with agriculture, and the emperor's control and domain over the land, right? And it's just a local flood story. I mean, it doesn't imagine that everyone dies or gets wiped out.
Mm-hmm.
Did a real flood have to happen for them to invent that story? No, not really, but it sort of helps inspire. And so a lot of like the indigenous traditions too, like, well, particularly like the one that we looked at, the two brothers climbing a tree, right? Well, that's something you would do in a flood, right? So it's probably based on some sort of human experience of
Sure.
flooding in South America, and you might climb a tree if a flood comes through to survive. But it's not like yeah, it's not like that is the core element of the story that they're trying to recount, a local thing that happened. It's just in the like collective cultural memory, people know what sort of things happen in floods, and so it inspires, as mythology sort of expands and develops. Uh, yeah, it forms that sort of inspiration. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sorry, maybe I didn't phrase the question right. So, um, like, maybe you're familiar with John Walton's view, where he's like, "Hey, it's recounting a local flood, the Noah's flood is, but it's
Oh,
portraying it globally,
right,
like the
right, right,
whole
right, right, right.
world.
Yes.
Maybe not
Okay.
not globally is not the best word, but at least the whole world. as they
Right.
knew it.
Yes. 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 So, okay. Okay. So that actually kind of comes back to like how I even got interested in this whole flood, looking at the individual flood myths in the first place. Because there was a guy on Twitter, I'd never heard of him before, but
Okay,
he's got a bit of a following. His name's Gavin Ortland.
nice.
Um, yeah.
Yep.
So, but anyway, he's and this is not me strawmanning him. Like he's a self-proclaimed Christian apologist. Um, he does have a PhD, but he was sort of putting forward this argument. He made a video that the flood in Noah, the Noah flood, was about a
Yep.
local flood. And
Yep.
I watched some of it, and I was honestly perplexed. This is not to like have a go at Gavin, in particular, but more the idea, because it just doesn't make sense to me. The flood story in Noah is very clearly imagining uh, that the flood waters rise above the mountains, and there's not enough like water on Earth for that to actually happen. But it's envisioning that everyone dies, everyone gets wiped out. And in his video, he wants to say, well, scientifically, we know there was no global flood, so it probably was just a local flood. But at the
Okay.
same time, the Bible is still true in the way that everyone gets wiped out because, well, we know that the Tower of Babel hadn't happened. And so everyone was living in Mesopotamia at the time, in
Mm,
Canaan, in that sort of region of the world. And I don't know, to me, I'm sitting there thinking, I'm not really sure what you're gaining here. Because on the one hand, you want to say, well, scientifically, we know that there is no global flood, but so the Noah story must be a local flood. But we'll also keep the part where everyone dies by putting all the humans in one spot. Well, scientifically, we know that
true.
didn't happen. People have been living in different parts of the world for tens and tens of thousands of years, and we have actual hard evidence of that. So it just doesn't make sense to me. I don't fully understand what you gain by trying
Mm,
to make the story scientifically plausible in one way. You have to deny science in another way. The
mm,
idea that Noah's story was a local story that wrote about it in a global way, I just don't think that really makes that much sense. Sure, in the Sumerian flood story, once upon a time, maybe that flood myth started as a local, like the river flooding and people dying, and that memory became the mythology that you sort of survived.
okay.
But Noah's Ark is entering a literary tradition. It's entering a literary tradition that has already been going for hundreds, well, over 1,000 years by the time that Noah's Ark comes along. And they're entering quite late into that sort of literary history. And they're borrowing elements not from the earliest versions, but the
Mm,
later versions like Atrahasis and Gilgamesh. So it's not that they're recounting a local flood. Noah's Ark is not about the memory of a local flood. It's using a pre-existing literary tradition and redeveloping
mm.
that for Judean literature. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah. So of course you have to obviously you're going to be much more confident than most Christian apologists that would say that where we got the global I get or Noah's flood from, where it came from. So maybe not as many people will go your route as far as the the yeah, like the origins or the literary tradition and all that. But that is really interesting because if you do say that it came from others those other traditions or um that corpus of literature, then yeah, you kind of do have to go that route. So that does make sense.
Well, I just
Um
think what makes more
mhm,
sense, right? Like you've got a clear situation in history that
mm,
indisputably this group of Judean scholars are learning
mhm,
Babylonian literature. They're learning to
mhm,
read Babylonian, and these flood myths exist in that culture, and they're popular writings in that culture. So, what makes more sense? That all these different flood stories actually happened and they all had different elements that everyone's remembered, or that the biblical writers, having learned that literature, are redeveloping that story. Like we see it all throughout the
Mm,
Bible. I just think that we're like, if you're going from a where does the evidence lead you, well, it
yeah.
just makes more sense that the biblical authors are inspired by that literature. I don't really know how. I just don't know for the value for someone like in Gavin Ortland's video. Um, why trying to mm, put the story into like a box and go, okay, well, we can make it more scientifically plausible by saying it was a local flood. I just don't know how that
Mm,
helps your case ultimately, because you have to deny the scientific truth that there were people living all throughout the
mm,
world in the period that the flood supposedly took place. Um, I just think, to gain in one area, you lose massively in another area. I just think the idea of holding the Noah's Ark story up as if it historically happened is always going to be scientifically problematic, because we just know there wasn't a global flood. Like scientists, whether it's from geology or archaeology or history, just know that there was not a global flood, particularly in the time period that the biblical authors want to, if it was read literally.
yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. We'll have to have you back on to have a little discussion about that and maybe go into that in more detail. So, yeah, once again, thank you for so much for coming on. Everyone, go make sure to check out Lachlan's channel and a lot of great scholarship over there. Any last words before we get going?
Yeah, look, I think I think it's worth, people who are really interested in this should go read some of this stuff for themselves. So I did mention a couple of books, like Alan Dundes has a volume. It was written in
Mm,
the 80s. The big volume of the world's flood myths is found in James Fraser's, I think it's 1906 book, called Folklore in the Old Testament. You can find that on, like archive.org or something like that. You can find Alan Dudas's book on archive.org too. So they're sort of like the most up-to-date big collections, and obviously there's lots of other like books about individual cultures that you can go read. But yeah, I would just
mm,
recommend people to go actually look at these flood stories for yourself, particularly if this idea that every culture has a flood story, therefore there must have been a global flood, is something you relate to. Yeah, go in and actually look at the individual stories and see how like varied they are, and see when they were actually written. Where are they ancient stories, or are they actually post-colonial stories?
hmm. Yeah, yeah, awesome. All right, thank you so much for coming on here. And
My pleasure.
I don't know. I guess I can't say I hope you have a good night because you're on the other
Yeah,
side of the world.
the middle of the
But
day here. You have a good
yeah.
night.
Oh, thank you, man. All right. All right, see you.
Appreciate it.